The weight of steel. The detonation cord lay coiled in Jake McNiece's muddy hands like a dead snake, its waxy coating slick with canal water and his own nervous sweat. 30 feet of lifeline between success and catastrophe, between getting his scattered paratroopers home and watching German panzers roll across what should have been empty water come sunrise. The twisted girder mocked him from its impossible angle, half submerged in the Normandy Canal, a steel testament to his failure and the enemy's stubborn engineering. Dawn was bleeding grey across the flooded fields around Carrington, and somewhere in the hedgerows behind him, German voices carried on the morning air like a death sentence counting down. McNiece had been crouched on this embankment for 20 minutes, staring at the bridge he'd half destroyed 12 hours ago, calculating angles and blast patterns with the cold mathematics that had kept him alive from Sicily to this god-forsaken French swampland. But the numbers wouldn't cooperate. His remaining TNT block might crack the beam, might even weaken it, but that girder would still be hanging there when the sun burned off the fog. The mission had started simple enough. The kind of clean demolition job that looked neat on paper and fell apart the moment boots hit French soil. Drop behind enemy lines with the filthy 13, rig the railway bridge spanning the canal outside Carrington, deny the Germans a crucial supply route into the Normandy beachhead. Simple. McNiece had learned to hate that word somewhere over the English Channel, watching flak bursts light up the night sky around their C-47 like deadly fireworks. The transport had taken hits over the drop zone, scattering his demolition team across 3 miles of flooded farmland that bore no resemblance to the tidy maps they'd studied back in England. McNiece had landed hard in a drainage ditch, his carefully prepared charges half drowned before he'd even cut himself free from his parachute harness. By the time he'd slogged through knee-deep water to reach the bridge, dawn was already threatening the eastern horizon, and his demolition kit had been reduced to this handful of soggy primers and one stubborn TNT block. The initial blast had brought down most of the span, sending locomotive rails and concrete chunks splashing into the canal like broken teeth. For a moment, watching the main structure collapse in a cascade of dust and twisted metal, McNiece had allowed himself to believe the job was done. Then the smoke cleared and he saw it. That single girder, scorched and twisted but somehow still bridging the gap, still offering the enemy a route across the water. "Sarge, we got company." Private Tommy Kowalski emerged from the fog like a ghost, his uniform torn and his rifle clutched against his chest. The kid had been with the 13 for 6 months, long enough to trust McNiece's reputation, but not long enough to stop looking surprised when their sergeant's miracles turned complicated. "How many?" McNiece asked, not taking his eyes off the girder. "Maybe a full platoon, coming this way along the tree line." McNiece nodded, testing the weight of his TNT block, feeling the integrity of the blasting cap and the frayed detonation cord that had somehow survived the night's chaos. Conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done, not with the girder's current position, not with the structural reinforcement provided by its twisted configuration, but conventional wisdom had never been his strong suit. "Tommy, get back to the tree line. Give me 5 minutes, then start laying down covering fire toward that farmhouse. Keep them busy." The kid hesitated, studying McNiece's face in the growing light. "What are you thinking, Sarge?" McNiece began looping the detonation cord around his waist, calculating timing and distance with the grim precision of a man about to bet everything on an engineering principle that existed only in his imagination. The plan forming in his mind felt less like demolition than controlled suicide. But sometimes the only way forward was straight through the thing trying to kill you. "I'm thinking the girder needs to come down, and we're about out of conventional options." He checked his watch, noting the German voices growing closer through the morning mist. 5 minutes to reach the beam, secure the charge, and get clear before enemy rifles found their range. 5 minutes to turn failure into success or die trying. The twisted steel seemed to mock him as he approached, water lapping at its base like a gentle reminder of how cold the canal would be if this went wrong. But McNiece had spent 3 years learning that war didn't care about your comfort, your safety, or your carefully laid plans. All war cared about was whether you got the job done. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The girder's steel felt ice-cold against McNiece's palm as he steadied himself on the slippery embankment, the twisted metal humming faintly with vibrations from German vehicles somewhere beyond the hedgerows. Up close, the beam revealed the full scope of his miscalculation from the night before. Blast damage that should have severed the span had instead created a grotesque sculpture of warped metal, stressed joints, and hairline fractures that seemed to mock every principle of demolition engineering he'd learned. Water sloshed around his boots as he waded deeper into the canal, the TNT block growing heavier with each step. The detonation cord played out behind him like a lifeline, 30 feet of waxy salvation that had to reach from the beam's most vulnerable joint back to whatever cover he could find on the embankment. Mathematics and prayer in equal measure, wrapped in the kind of desperate improvisation that separated living paratroopers from dead heroes. From the tree line, rifle fire cracked across the morning air. Tommy and the others laying down covering fire as ordered, buying him minutes he might not live to appreciate. The sound of German voices grew sharper now, accompanied by the metallic rattle of equipment and boots splashing through shallow water. Close enough that McNiece could distinguish individual words. Close enough that he felt exposed and foolish, crouched in the canal with explosives in his hands and nowhere to run. "McNiece, what's your status?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Harrison, crackling through the morning mist with the tight precision of an officer trying to coordinate scattered units while enemy patrols closed the distance. Harrison had been skeptical of the Filthy 13's method since Normandy, preferring textbook solutions to the improvised chaos that McNiece called tactical flexibility. "Working on it, sir," McNiece called back, securing the TNT block to the girder's most damaged joint. The charge felt inadequate against the mass of twisted steel, but placement mattered more than quantity in demolition work. Find the right stress point, apply pressure where the metal was already weakened, and let physics do the rest. The detonation cord unreeled as he retreated, each foot of distance measured against the approaching German voices and the thin margin of time separating success from catastrophe. Behind him, more rifle fire erupted from the hedgerows, his men engaging targets he couldn't see, buying him seconds with their own lives while he played engineer in a muddy canal. 20 feet from the girder, the cord went taut. McNiece stared at the remaining distance to solid cover, calculating blast radius against his chances of reaching the embankment before German rifles found their range. The mathematics were unforgiving. Too close to the charge and the explosion would kill him. Too far from cover and enemy fire would finish the job before he could complete the demolition. "Sarge, they're getting closer." Tommy's voice carried across the water, underlaid with the sharp anxiety of a young soldier watching his NCO prepare to do something that looked suspiciously like suicide. The kid had seen McNiece pull off impossible demolitions before, but always with more explosives, better positions, and escape routes that didn't require betting everything on 30 feet of fraying cord. McNiece checked the blasting cap, testing the connection between TNT and detonation cord with fingers that trembled despite 3 years of practice under fire. The charge was as ready as improvisation and prayer could make it, positioned on the girder's most vulnerable joint, where blast damage and metal fatigue had already begun the work his explosives would finish. German voices rose from the opposite bank, sharp commands that needed no translation, accompanied by the splash of boots in shallow water and the distinctive sound of rifle bolts working. Enemy soldiers moving into position, preparing to cross what remained of the bridge or establish firing positions to protect it from further demolition attempts. The plan, such as it was, crystallized in McNiece's mind with the brutal clarity that came from having no other options. 30 feet of cord, one TNT block, and whatever gods looked after demolition sergeants who'd run out of conventional wisdom. He began backing toward the embankment, letting the detonation cord play out in his hands like a fuse connected to his own survival. Lieutenant Harrison appeared at the tree line, crouched low behind a shattered farm cart, his field glasses focused on the canal crossing. McNiece could see the calculation in the officer's posture, weighing the tactical importance of destroying the girder against the cost of losing his best demolition NCO in what looked like a desperate gamble. McNiece, fall back. We'll call in artillery. But McNiece knew what Harrison couldn't see from the tree line. Artillery would take too long to coordinate, and German engineering units were probably already moving bridging equipment toward the canal. That twisted girder represented more than failed demolition. It was a lifeline the enemy could exploit within hours, turning McNiece's incomplete success into strategic disaster. The detonation cord reached its limit, leaving him exposed on the muddy embankment with German rifles searching for targets through the morning fog. Time had run out for safe solutions and textbook tactics. All that remained was the weight of the charge in his hands and the terrible mathematics of controlled destruction. The blasting cap felt smaller than a cigarette between McNiece's mud-caked fingers, its copper housing reflecting the weak dawn light like a talisman against the growing sound of German voices across the canal. From his exposed position on the embankment, he could see enemy soldiers moving through the hedgerows on the opposite bank, dark shapes that appeared and vanished in the morning mist like deadly phantoms searching for targets. Lieutenant Harrison's field glasses tracked the enemy movement, his jaw tight with the kind of calculation officers made when tactical manuals met ground reality and came up short. The young officer had been with the 506th PIR long enough to trust McNiece's demolition work, but not long enough to stop questioning methods that looked more like controlled suicide than proper military engineering. McNiece, I'm ordering you to fall back. We'll request naval gunfire support. But McNiece knew what Harrison couldn't see from the tree line. The girder's position made it nearly invisible from offshore observation, and German engineers were probably already moving bridging equipment through the flooded countryside. Every minute the twisted span remained intact brought enemy armor closer to crossing the canal and rolling into the scattered remnants of airborne units still trying to consolidate their positions around Carentan. The detonation cord stretched taut in his hands, 30 feet of waxy lifeline between success and the kind of failure that got entire companies overrun by panzer columns. McNiece had seen what happened when bridges stayed up too long. Sicily, where a blown crossing could have stopped German armor from reaching the beaches. Italy, where delayed demolitions cost paratroopers their lives and officers their commands. From somewhere beyond the fog came a new sound, the distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles moving across muddy ground, accompanied by the metallic clanking that meant German armor was approaching the canal from the east. Not immediately threatening, but close enough to remind McNiece why that girder had to come down before enemy engineers could reinforce it with pontoon supports. Private Kowalski materialized beside him, breathing hard from his sprint across open ground, his rifle still smoking from the covering fire he'd been laying down. The kid's face carried the hollow exhaustion of a paratrooper who'd been moving through enemy territory all night, living on adrenaline and the thin hope that their demolition sergeant might work another miracle. "Sarge, we got problems. Radio intercept says German engineers are maybe 30 minutes out with bridging equipment. And Lieutenant Harrison wants to know your plan for getting out of here alive." McNiece tested the connection between blasting cap and detonation cord one more time, feeling the familiar weight of explosives and responsibility that had defined his war since Sicily. The plan existed more in instinct than mathematics. Place the charge where metal fatigue and blast damage had already weakened the girder's structure, retreat as far as the cord allowed, and trust 30 feet of fuse and 1 TNT block to finish what his botched night raid had started. "Tell Harrison I'll be off this embankment in 2 minutes, one way or another." The sound of German voices grew clearer, accompanied by the splash of boots in shallow water and equipment rattles that spoke of soldiers preparing to cross what remained of the bridge. Enemy infantry moving into position to secure the span while their engineers worked, buying time with rifle fire and the kind of stubborn defense that turned simple demolitions into complicated battles. McNiece began his retreat along the embankment, letting the detonation cord play out behind him like a trail leading back to the twisted girder and its cargo of TNT. Each step measured against approaching enemy fire, each foot of cord calculated against blast radius and the thin margin between successful demolition and becoming scattered pieces along the canal bank. 20 feet from the charge, rifle fire erupted from across the water, German soldiers engaging targets they could barely see through the fog, muzzle flashes strobing in the grey morning air like deadly fireflies. Bullets whined overhead, close enough that McNiece could hear their passage, close enough that he dropped to his belly and began crawling toward whatever cover the broken embankment might provide. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving. Too close to the girder when the TNT detonated and the blast would kill him. Too far from the charge and he'd run out of detonation cord before reaching safety. Somewhere between those two certainties lay the narrow space where demolition engineering met desperate improvisation and occasionally produced miracles. Behind him, the filthy 13 maintained covering fire from the tree line, their rifles crackling in short, disciplined bursts that spoke of paratroopers who'd learned to make every round count. McNiece could hear Tommy's voice among the others, directing fire and keeping the enemy's heads down, while their sergeant prepared to bet everything on 30 feet of cord and one well-placed charge. The girder loomed through the mist, twisted and scarred, but still bridging the canal, still offering the enemy a route across water that should have been impassable. McNiece reached the limit of his detonation cord, pressed himself against the muddy embankment, and prepared to discover whether improvisation and prayer could substitute for proper demolition technique. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. McNiece's thumb hovered over the blasting cap, slick with sweat and canal water, while German rifle fire cracked overhead like deadly hail seeking flesh. The detonation cord stretched taut between his position and the twisted girder, 30 feet of lifeline that had to be enough because there were no alternatives left, and enemy armor was rumbling closer through the Normandy countryside with each passing minute. The girder hung suspended over the canal like a steel accusation, mocking every principle of demolition engineering he'd learned in 3 years of blowing things to hell across Europe. Conventional wisdom said 1 TNT block couldn't bring down that much twisted metal. Conventional wisdom said the charge was positioned wrong, the cord too short, the blast angle all wrong for clean structural failure. But McNiece had built his reputation on making conventional wisdom irrelevant. From the tree line, Lieutenant Harrison's voice carried across the morning air with the tight urgency of an officer watching his best demolition NCO prepare to do something that looked suspiciously like suicide. "McNiece, I'm ordering you to fall back. German armor is 15 minutes out, but 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours if that girder remained intact." McNiece had seen what happened when bridges stayed up too long. Panzer columns rolling across spans that should have been rubble, paratroopers caught in open ground with nowhere to retreat, entire operations collapsing because one demolition job went wrong at the crucial moment. Private Kowalski appeared beside him in the muddy depression, breathing hard from his sprint across exposed ground, his rifle ready despite the impossible odds of surviving contact with a German platoon in daylight. The kid had been with the Filthy 13 long enough to trust McNiece's methods, but not long enough to stop looking nervous when those methods defied every manual the army had ever written. "Sarge, what's the plan?" McNiece tested the blasting cap one final time, feeling the small weight of copper and explosive that would either bring down the girder or announce his failure to every German soldier within a mile. The plan existed more in desperation than engineering: trust metal fatigue and blast damage to do what insufficient explosives couldn't, and hope 30 feet of detonation cord would be enough to keep him alive when the TNT detonated. "Plan is to blow that beam and get out of here before the panzers arrive." German voices rose from across the canal, sharp with the urgency of soldiers who'd spotted movement and were preparing to engage. Rifle bolts worked with metallic precision, followed by the distinctive sound of machine gun teams setting up firing positions to cover what remained of the bridge crossing. Enemy infantry moving into position while their engineers approached with bridging equipment. McNiece squeezed the blasting cap, feeling the familiar sensation of electrical current flowing through the detonation cord toward its appointment with one carefully placed TNT block. Physics and prayer wrapped in 30 feet of waxy cord, carrying his bet that metal fatigue would accomplish what insufficient explosives couldn't manage alone. The explosion, when it came, felt like the world coming apart in slow motion. A sharp crack that echoed across the canal, followed by the groaning surrender of stressed metal finally admitting defeat. The twisted girder seemed to hang in space for an impossible moment, defying gravity and German engineering before dropping into the muddy water with a splash that sent ripples across the surface. Debris rained down around McNiece as he pressed himself against the embankment, chunks of concrete and twisted steel splashing into the canal like the scattered pieces of his own certainty. The blast had been smaller than he'd hoped, louder than he'd expected, and somehow exactly sufficient to finish what his botched night raid had started. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Lieutenant Harrison's voice calling from the tree line. Sharp commands that probably meant something important, but sounded like distant thunder after the explosion's intimate violence. German rifle fire erupted from across the water, muzzle flashes strobing through the morning mist as enemy soldiers engaged targets they couldn't clearly see. Tommy grabbed McNiece's arm, hauling him upright and pointing toward the tree line, where the rest of the Filthy 13 waited with covering fire and escape routes mapped through the flooded countryside. The canal crossing lay empty now, nothing but dark water and scattered debris where the girder had bridged the gap just moments before. "Move, Sarge! German armor's getting close!" McNiece staggered to his feet, ears still ringing from the blast, watching the empty space where the twisted girder had mocked his demolition skills just minutes before. The job was done, finally and properly, but success felt heavier than failure somehow, weighted with the knowledge that 30 feet of cord and one TNT block had been all that stood between scattered paratroopers and German panzer columns. As they reached the tree line, the sound of tracked vehicles grew louder through the morning fog. German armor approaching a crossing that no longer existed. Engineers arriving to reinforce a bridge that had finally surrendered to physics and stubborn determination. Behind them, rifle fire continued to crack across the canal, but without tactical purpose now that the span lay submerged beneath dark water. The demolition was complete. The crossing denied, the mission accomplished with the kind of improvised violence that characterized airborne operations in the Norman countryside. But as McNiece followed his men through the hedgerows toward friendly lines, he carried the weight of knowing how close conventional wisdom had come to being exactly right. The truth about the canal bridge lived in the space between official reports and private memory, in the gap where heroic narrative met the actual weight of 30 feet of detonation cord and one desperate gamble that could have scattered Jake McNiece across the Norman countryside like broken equipment. 3 days after the girder fell, McNiece sat in a farmhouse cellar outside Carentan, watching Lieutenant Harrison compose the after-action report that would reduce 20 minutes of improvised demolition to 3 clean sentences about successful bridge destruction and mission accomplishment. The words looked neat on paper. Objectives achieved, enemy crossing denied, minimal casualties sustained, but they couldn't capture the texture of failure transformed into success by 30 feet of cord and pure stubborn luck. "How do you want me to write this, Sergeant?" Harrison's pencil hovered over the report form, his eyes carrying the weight of an officer trying to balance accurate documentation with the kind of truth that might get his demolition NCO court-martialed for reckless endangerment of personnel. McNiece studied his hands, noting how they still trembled slightly when he handled blasting caps or measured detonation cord. The girder had come down exactly as planned, but planning and execution were different animals entirely when the plan existed mostly in desperate instinct and mathematical prayers. "Write it however keeps the brass happy, sir." What Harrison couldn't write, what no report would ever capture, was the moment McNiece had realized the detonation cord wasn't long enough for safe demolition. 30 feet between the charge and anything resembling cover, with German rifles searching for targets through the morning fog and armor approaching from the east. The textbook answer was to abort the mission, fall back, request artillery or air support. But textbooks didn't account for twisted girders that mocked demolition engineering, or the sound of panzer engines growing closer through flooded countryside, or the knowledge that German engineers could reinforce that span within hours and turn incomplete success into strategic disaster. Sometimes the only choice was between certain failure and possible survival, between following procedures and trusting 30 feet of cord to carry salvation or oblivion with equal precision. Private Kowalski appeared at the cellar entrance, his uniform still mud-caked from their retreat through the hedgerows, carrying coffee that tasted like muddy water and felt like salvation after 36 hours of moving through enemy territory. The kid had been quiet since the bridge demolition, processing what he'd witnessed through the filter of a young soldier, learning that heroic actions often looked like barely controlled chaos from the inside. "Sarge, you ever wonder what would have happened if that cord had been too short?" McNiece accepted the coffee, feeling its warmth through cracked ceramic and muddy fingers that still carried the memory of that blasting cap's weight. The honest answer was that he'd been wondering about nothing else for 3 days, calculating and recalculating blast radius against retreat distance, wondering if 30 feet of cord represented mathematical precision or dumb luck wrapped in demolition theory. Cord was exactly the right length, Tommy. That's all that matters. But late at night, when exhaustion finally overcame adrenaline and allowed something approaching sleep, McNiece's dreams returned him to that embankment with German voices growing closer and detonation cord that might or might not reach safety. In those dreams, the mathematics worked out differently. Blast radius expanding, retreat distance shrinking, 30 feet of cord becoming 29 or 28, until the margin between success and catastrophe disappeared entirely. The official citation would eventually describe textbook demolition under fire, successful denial of enemy crossing, and exemplary leadership under pressure. Clean language that transformed 20 minutes of desperate improvisation into the kind of neat tactical victory that looked good in reports and justified the Filthy 13's reputation for accomplishing impossible missions through unorthodox methods. What the citation couldn't capture was the weight of knowing how thin the margin had been, how close conventional wisdom had come to being exactly right about insufficient explosives and improper placement. The girder had fallen because metal fatigue and blast damage created weak points that one TNT block could exploit, but also because 30 feet of cord had been exactly sufficient to reach questionable safety, and no more. Harrison finished the report with the kind of precise language that satisfied headquarters requirements while protecting his men from questions about methods that bent regulations past their breaking point. Mission accomplished, Crossing denied. Personnel intact. 3 sentences that contained everything command needed to know, and nothing about the actual texture of success, balanced on improvised demolition and mathematical prayers. Reports going up the chain tomorrow, McNiece. Expect some attention from higher headquarters. McNiece nodded, understanding that attention from headquarters meant questions about methods, requests for detailed explanations of how insufficient explosives had accomplished textbook demolition, and the kind of scrutiny that made successful rule-breaking more complicated than simple failure. The Army liked results, but it preferred results achieved through approved procedures and proper equipment allocation. Outside the farmhouse, German artillery rumbled in the distance, harassing fire that meant enemy forces were still active in the area, still probing for weaknesses in airborne positions that had been hastily consolidated after scattered night drops across flooded countryside. The canal crossing remained secure, the bridge thoroughly demolished, the mission complete, according to every metric that mattered to tactical planners. But success carried its own weight, heavier than failure somehow, because it had to be carried forward into future missions where 30 feet of cord might not be sufficient, where mathematical prayers might not find answers, where the gap between heroic narrative and private memory would continue to widen with each report that transformed chaos into clean victory. 23 years after the canal bridge fell, Jake McNiece stood on a railroad platform in Oklahoma, watching a freight train rumble overhead on steel girders that sang with the same metallic harmony that had haunted his sleep since Normandy. The sound transported him instantly, not to heroic memory or polished anecdote, but to muddy embankments and the weight of detonation cord in hands that still trembled when thunder rolled too close to controlled explosions. The official story had crystallized over the decades into something clean and heroic. Demolition sergeant saves scattered paratroopers through daring bridge destruction under enemy fire. Exemplary leadership and tactical innovation under impossible conditions. The kind of narrative that looked good in unit histories and veteran reunion speeches, reduced to talking points that transformed 20 minutes of desperate improvisation into textbook tactical victory. But memory was a different animal entirely, carrying textures that no citation could capture and weights that official reports couldn't measure. The truth lived in the space between what happened and what could be safely told. 30 feet of detonation cord that might or might not have reached safety. 1 TNT block gambling against German engineering and the mathematical certainties of blast radius versus retreat distance. McNiece's grandson found him on the platform, 8 years old and fascinated by trains and bridges, and the grandfather who'd blown things up in the war but never talked about it in detail. The boy's questions were innocent and direct, unfiltered by the careful language adults used when discussing combat actions and the invisible costs of surviving what others didn't. "Grandpa, did you really blow up a bridge in France?" McNiece studied the steel girders overhead, feeling their vibrations through the platform's wooden planks, remembering how twisted metal had groaned before surrendering to physics and one carefully placed charge. The honest answer was complicated, success and failure wrapped together in ways that defied clean narrative, heroism and terror occupying the same 20 minutes of a June morning when everything went wrong and somehow worked anyway. "Yeah, I blew up a bridge. Took 2 tries to get it right." What he couldn't explain to an 8-year-old was the weight of carrying that morning forward through decades of civilian life. The way certain sounds or vibrations returned him instantly to muddy embankments, and the sensation of electrical current flowing through detonation cord toward an appointment with German steel. The bridge had fallen exactly as planned. But planning and execution were different animals, when the plan existed mostly in desperate mathematics and the thin hope that 30 feet would be sufficient. The train passed overhead with a final rumble that echoed across the Oklahoma countryside, leaving silence that felt heavier than the mechanical noise. McNiece's hands, weathered by decades of post-war work, still carried the muscle memory of testing blasting caps and measuring cord lengths, with fingers that understood the difference between salvation and catastrophe measured in feet and inches. His grandson had moved on to other questions, baseball scores and dinner plans, and the immediate concerns of childhood that didn't include the lasting texture of actions that looked heroic from the outside, but felt like barely controlled chaos from within. McNiece was grateful for the boy's attention span, for the mercy of questions that didn't probe too deeply into the space where legend met memory and came up short. Lieutenant Harrison had died in Korea, carrying McNiece's bridge demolition as one entry in a career full of tactical decisions and after-action reports that reduced combat to clean sentences on official forms. The report had satisfied headquarters requirements, protected the Filthy 13 from uncomfortable questions, and transformed 20 minutes of improvised demolition into the kind of neat success story that justified unconventional methods and unorthodox personnel. But privately, in letters exchanged over the years before Korea claimed him, Harrison had wondered about the same details that haunted McNiece's sleep. How close had the mathematics really been? What would have happened if the detonation cord had been 29 feet instead of 30? How much of success was planning, and how much was the kind of luck that couldn't be replicated or counted on? Private Kowalski had made it through the war and 25 years of civilian life before a heart attack found him in a Cleveland factory, dying with memories that included a muddy canal embankment and the sight of his demolition sergeant betting everything on 30 feet of cord and one TNT block. At the funeral, Kowalski's widow had mentioned dreams her husband never discussed in detail. Bridges that wouldn't fall, detonation cord that came up short, and the sound of German voices growing closer through morning fog. The platform grew quiet as afternoon faded toward evening, leaving McNiece alone with steel girders and the persistent echo of metal under stress. He understood now what Harrison had tried to capture in his after-action report, the need to transform chaos into narrative, to find clean meaning in actions that felt more like survival than heroism when experienced from the inside. The truth about the canal bridge would die with the men who lived it, replaced by citations and unit histories that served their own necessary purposes. But sometimes, standing on railroad platforms or hearing freight trains in the distance, McNiece returned to that muddy embankment where 30 feet of detonation cord had been exactly sufficient to reach questionable safety and no more. In those moments, success and failure occupied the same space, separated by margins too thin to measure and too heavy to forget. His grandson reappeared, tugging at his grandfather's coat and pointing toward the car, where family waited with dinner plans and the comfortable certainties of civilian evening. McNiece followed willingly, carrying the weight of that June morning in Normandy like a steel girder, invisible to others, but fundamental to the structure of everything that came after. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.